New York, and Joy Soup. After a day touring the museums that gird New York's Central Park, my soul seemed to swell beyond my intellectual comprehension. I returned to the Crowne Plaza Hotel at 50th and Broadway and dressed into my red shirt, silver tie, and three-piece black suit. Then I set off for Frederick P. Rose Hall, home of jazz at Lincoln Center. I went with my sister Mary and my brother-in-law Mike. As we crossed Columbus Circle at the southwest corner of Central Park that mid-May of 2006, the early evening felt warm and sassy. Skateboarders whirled and skidded beneath the upright statue of Columbus. Cabs and cars swirled along the roundabout, orbiting the gigantic lingam and the circle's concrete yoni. The spring concert of the Jazz Band Classic, the big band jazz program for the New York Youth Symphony, would be in the Allen Room. The sixth-floor venue's eastern wall consisted of 48 panes of glass, each about 50 square feet. The audience could look directly down onto the statue of Columbus. Central Park South extended eastward, and the fully leafed-out trees of the park spewed springtime exuberance. Horse-drawn carriages lined up along the park, and occasionally turned into traffic with their romantic fares. As the sun set, its reflections rose up the nearby apartment building windows. Hot flames rode heavenward, and a television screen flickered in one corner apartment. Through the first half of the jazz program, the JBC played classic big band music by Duke Ellington and Ray Noble. After the intermission, the second half of the program would begin with the world premiere of Dan Cavanagh's Joy Soup. This big band jazz composition had been commissioned by the Jazz Band Classic and was a musical interpretation of my poem of the same title. When a poem is titled Joy Soup, the emotional content had better provide exhilaration. When a composer reads the poem and creates a musical piece based upon its content, you can only hope that joy will vibrantly manifest itself through his imagination and subsequently through the musicians. I felt doubly proud of Dan's accomplishments. As my nephew, I feel especially close to his work. Secondly, he has used my poetry as inspiration for 4 musical compositions, a chamber music piece, and 3 jazz big band pieces, including Joy Soup. Dan and his wife sat with us in the middle of the sold-out recital hall. The amphitheater-styled venue, with its rows rising more steeply than in other concert halls, accentuated our view of the outdoors. As the intermission concluded, my brother-in-law Mike, a practical, concrete thinker, leaned over and said to me in awe, "This is getting more and more surreal." The sun had set, and among the taillights, the headlights, the taxi lights, the dusky evening sky gave its own shimmer to the park, to the streets, and to the lingam and yoni before us. Then the musical piece began. The yellow, flame-colored cabs, their red, cherry-like taillights, and headlight beams reflected and danced on the multiple glass panes as if the city had provided a psychedelic light show. The traffic itself was visible down on the streets, and we seemed to be floating in a liquid of light and sound. Dan's contemporary jazz compositions are noted for their changes in musical times, their varying key changes and melodic phrases, and that jazz staple, plenty of room for expressive solo work. Joy Soup was no exception. As the piece played, I could hear his responses to my words. I had already felt the veil drop, and I saw that we were swimming in a vast tureen of Joy Soup. Since the poem was my response to the weekly chanting sessions I have with my friends, artists, poets, clerics, and musicians, I heard Dan's creativity echo and enhance my emotions. I could hear the soaring vocal of David Ballman, who sings with the Twin Cities Gospel Choir. I could hear the crackling, flaming Django Reinhardt sounds of the guitarist and friend Glenn Helgeson. I heard the poetic vowel sounds of Robert Bly's poems, which are honeydews floating in the air. I was aware that Robert was in Tehran that very night, reading Hafez and Rumi in English for his Iranian hosts. Their Persian ancestors were the inspiration for our men's chanting group. The throbbing environment of New York, this cultural capital of the world, its cheesy street vending tables, its sublime works of art, the neon theater lights and jumbotron billboards on Broadway, the unstopping street sounds, the vibrations of the subway lifting like tremors from below ground, the memory of our tiny singing room with its incense and candles, our occasionally off-key chants, the giant oaks like those of fairy tales, which darkened the path to our singing room, the street musicians in Central Park, the guzzles of Hafez, the quatrains of Rumi, which triggered my need to write Joy Soup, the prestige of Lincoln Center, the halos of the JBC horn section, the tenor saxophonist slowly dissolving his notes as the piece ended with my last line, "Let me be a sugar cube dropped into the tea," and the emotional gratification I felt while sitting with my family, hearing the creation of my nephew without a veil of distraction. Truly, a Joy Soup. Spiralic energy existed inside and outside of me. I heard my sister and brother-in-law express the same feelings. My nephew listened more critically. He felt that the piece was too mature for this jazz band, which consisted of college-age and graduate students. There were moments when the band had to work too hard, as if they had not had enough time to rehearse such a contemporary piece. However, those moments did not detract from the emotional impact of the piece. As Plato wrote, "All that is beautiful is difficult." Dan had produced a musical version of my poem without needing words for its expression. I felt the swirling joy, and that joy carried into the next day when I visited the Museum of Modern Art and saw the painting, The Garden of Earthly Delights, which was completed in 2003 by the Calcutta-born artist Raghib Shah. This colorful, wall-sized painting with gaudy colors, intricate bird images, small animals, and innumerable flowers sprinkled amid mostly green foliage, was based on early Islamic Persian miniatures. It felt as if I were again immersed in Bali, where I had visited weeks earlier. The spiral of influences continued. Only after I arrived at the JFK airport the next evening, while sitting in that dirty, crowded terminal, waiting for the weather-delayed flight home, listening to a cacophony of mangled announcements and irritated passenger voices, which occasionally burst into arguments. Only then did I descend from the effects of joy soup. After my pilgrimage trip along the Mississippi River in February, after traversing Maya's map of Branson, Beale Street, and the French Quarter, after visiting the paradise temples on the sacred mountain of Bali, Gunung Agung, after immersing myself in the intense, ethereal gamelan concerts in Bali in April, after witnessing the goddess beauty pouring through the young Balinese dancer, after strolling through the dynamism of New York's art centers, where I dove into Rembrandt, Rubens, Kandinsky, Pollock, and Picasso, I realized that I had been on a tour of aesthetic and spiritual intensity, which stripped my soul of its defenses, then imbued me with billions upon billions of emotional ions. I had to acknowledge the spiralic continuation of creative influence and inspiration. I seemed to be swimming in a vast tureen of joy soup. And here's the poem, Joy Soup. There are nights when a veil drops, and I see that we're swimming in a vast tureen of joy soup. Our mumbled songs, our hoarse shouts, our gurgling, rambling chants simmer over Glenn's flaming guitar. Our words are fruit grease wiggling to the surface. Robert's poems are honeydews floating in the air. With a cherry in his voice, David sings to a goddess who smacks her lips at the aroma of our cooking souls. Light a match. My poems are just kindling for the stove. Let my words be incense thrown on the charcoal. Let me be a sugar cube dropped into the tea.